The morning Daphne Holloway walked into the Grand Cavendish Hotel and told a man to get out of her event, she had no idea she was about to lose everything she'd spent 11 years building. She didn't know his name. She didn't ask. That was the problem. The Cavendish Grand Ballroom on the 42nd floor of the Cavendish Tower in downtown Chicago was the kind of place where people came to close deals worth more than most people would earn in 3 lifetimes. Crystal chandeliers, white-gloved staff, views of Lake Michigan that made the sky look like it had been painted by someone showing off. Daphne had rented the entire floor for the afternoon, a private reception for Holloway Capital's annual investor summit, the kind of event where the wrong person in the room was not just an inconvenience, it was a liability. She had been running Holloway Capital for 6 years. Before that, she'd spent 5 years watching her father run it into the ground from the corner office he refused to leave until the bank literally changed the locks. She'd rebuilt it from a mid-sized family fund with a damaged reputation into one of the most watched private equity firms in the Midwest. She was 41 years old. She had earned the right to be particular about who stood in her ballroom. That was what she told herself later when she was trying to understand how she had been so wrong. It started at 2:17 in the afternoon. The reception had been going for 40 minutes. Daphne was working the room the way she always did, unhurried, deliberate, moving from cluster to cluster, with the kind of focused attention that made people feel briefly like the most important person in Chicago. She'd just finished a conversation with a pension fund manager from Milwaukee when she noticed him. He was standing near the far window, alone, holding a glass of sparkling water and looking out at the lake. He was wearing dark jeans, a navy flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and boots that had seen better days. No jacket, no lanyard, no badge. He had the kind of build that suggested he'd done physical work at some point in his life. Broad through the shoulders, unhurried in the way he held himself, like a man comfortable in his own skin, regardless of where that skin happened to be standing. He looked like he'd wandered in from a job site. Daphne crossed the room toward him. Her event coordinator, a meticulous woman named Patricia, materialized at her elbow from nowhere, the way Patricia always did when she sensed trouble. "Do we know him?" Daphne asked, keeping her voice low. Patricia consulted her tablet. "I don't have him registered." "I can check." "It's fine." Daphne was already moving. She stopped a few feet from the man at the window. He turned when he heard her approach unhurried and offered a small, easy smile. His eyes were steady, light brown, the kind of eyes that took things in slowly and missed very little. "Hi there," he said. "Hi." Daphne kept her voice pleasant but brisk, the tone she used when she needed to communicate a thing without technically saying it. "This is a private event. I think you may have taken a wrong turn somewhere." He looked at her for a moment. "I don't think so," he said, not defensive, just matter of fact. "I'm sorry? I was invited," he said. He reached into the breast pocket of his flannel shirt, not a jacket, a flannel shirt, and produced a small cream-colored card. He held it out. Daphne didn't take it. "By whom?" "Gerald Ashworth," he said. "We go back a ways." Gerald Ashworth was the managing partner of Ashworth Meridian, an infrastructure investment group out of Indianapolis. He was also one of Daphne's largest limited partners, and the man she was planning to approach in the next 20 minutes about a 9-figure commitment to her next fund. The idea that Gerald had personally invited someone who looked like this to this event without her knowing about it struck her as so implausible that she set it aside almost immediately. "I'll need to verify that," she said. Of course, he was still easy about it. That bothered her more than she expected. "Until then," she said, "I'm going to have to ask you to wait downstairs. The lobby's very comfortable. I can have someone bring you coffee." Something shifted in his expression then, not anger, not embarrassment. More like the particular look of a person who has encountered this specific thing before and has long since stopped being surprised by it. He held her gaze for 1 beat longer than was comfortable. "Sure," he said, and set his glass of sparkling water on the tray of a passing server with the quiet precision of a man who knows exactly what he's doing. "I'll be in the lobby." He walked out without hurrying. Patricia appeared again. "Miss Holloway, I really think we should verify before we—" "Please find out who he is," Daphne said, already turning back toward the room. "And call Gerald's assistant to confirm he actually has a guest coming." She found Gerald 12 minutes later, near the bar, deep in conversation with 2 people from a sovereign wealth fund. She waited, made small talk, eventually drew him aside. "I had to ask someone to step out earlier," she said. "He claimed you'd invited him." "Flannel shirt, boots." Gerald Ashworth went very still. "Tall," he said. "Dark hair, watches everything? That sounds about right." Gerald set down his drink slowly. He was a 63-year-old man who had been in finance for 4 decades and had learned in that time to manage his facial expressions with the precision of a surgeon. But something moved across his face now that he wasn't quite fast enough to stop. "That's Callum Reid," Gerald said. The name landed without meaning at first, and then it landed correctly. Callum Reid, the Callum Reid, founder of Meridian Structural, the private infrastructure company that had quietly bought and consolidated a portfolio of toll roads, bridges, and freight rail lines across the central United States over the past decade. The company that, according to the last coverage Daphne had read, was sitting on roughly $4 billion in assets and had recently begun exploring a fund structure that would allow outside institutional investors to participate in future acquisitions. A fund structure, meaning they were looking for a manager. "He's been talking to a few people," Gerald said carefully, "about who should run the vehicle. He reached out to me for introductions. I thought this would be a natural." He stopped. "Where is he now?" "The lobby," Daphne said. Gerald looked at her. He didn't say anything for a long moment. He didn't need to. "I'll go down," he said finally. She called Patricia from the hallway. "Get me everything we have on Callum Reid of Meridian Structural," she said. "Right now." By the time she reached the elevator, Patricia had pulled the basics. By the time she reached the lobby, she had read enough to understand exactly what she had done. Callum Reid was 44 years old. He had grown up in Rockford, Illinois, the son of a construction foreman and a school librarian. He'd worked job sites through high school and college, graduated from University of Illinois with a civil engineering degree, spent 8 years at a mid-size infrastructure firm before founding Meridian Structural at 32 with his own savings and a single asset, a deteriorating freight rail corridor in downstate Illinois that everyone else had passed on. He had rebuilt it. He had sold a partial stake to a Canadian pension fund 3 years later and used the proceeds to acquire 4 more assets. He had never taken a salary above $180,000 until last year. He still drove a 2019 pickup truck. He did not own a yacht or a vacation property or a suit that cost more than $600. He also controlled the largest privately held infrastructure portfolio between the Appalachians and the Rockies. And he reportedly made decisions, according to one profile, based almost entirely on personal trust. He had been quoted, "The numbers are the floor. Character is the ceiling. I've never written a check to someone I didn't believe in as a human being first." Daphne stepped out of the elevator into the lobby of the Cavendish and found him exactly where she'd sent him, seated in one of the lobby's low leather chairs, one ankle crossed over the opposite knee, scrolling through something on his phone without apparent distress. Gerald was already there beside him, leaning forward in conversation. Both men looked up when she approached. "Mr. Reid," she said. "Ms. Holloway." His voice was neutral. Not cold, exactly, something more careful than cold. "I owe you an apology," she said. She had rehearsed several versions of this in the elevator. She settled on the plain one. "I made an assumption I had no basis for making. That was wrong." He looked at her. He nodded once, slowly, like a man filing something away. Gerald made a small sound that might have been relief. "Why don't we head back up?" "Actually," Callum said, "I think I'm going to call it a day." He put his phone in his pocket and stood. He was taller than she'd realized, or maybe the lobby just had different proportions than the ballroom. "Daphne, I appreciate you coming down." He used her first name. She wasn't sure if that was a signal or just how he spoke. "If you have a few minutes," she started, "I'd really welcome the chance to—" "I'm sure you would." There was no meanness in it, but there was no softness either. "I'll be in touch, Gerald." He shook Gerald's hand. He nodded to Daphne. He walked out through the revolving door and into the gray March afternoon, and that was that. Gerald didn't look at her right away. He looked at the door. "He was going to offer you the mandate," Gerald said. "He told me in the elevator on the way up." He'd already looked at 4 other firms. "You were his first choice." Daphne didn't say anything. "He's particular about how people treat others," Gerald said. "Not just him, others." He picked up his coat from the back of the chair. "I don't know if that helps you understand." It didn't help, but it explained everything. She didn't sleep that night. She lay in her apartment on the 28th floor of a building 6 blocks from the office and stared at the ceiling and tried to do what she always did with a setback, which was to locate the precise decision that had caused it and understand exactly why she'd made it. This was how she had rebuilt Holloway Capital. This was how she had survived every difficult year, understand the mistake, extract the lesson, move forward with better information. The decision was clear enough. She had looked at a man and decided in approximately 4 seconds who he was and whether he belonged in a room she controlled. She had done this based on his clothing and the fact that she didn't recognize him. She had done it efficiently and without cruelty, which in some ways made it worse, because it meant the assumption wasn't an accident, it was a reflex. Something built in. The question that kept her awake was not "why did I do that," but "how many times have I done that and never found out?" She called Gerald the next morning. "I'm not asking you to broker anything," she said. "I just want to know if he'll take a meeting, his choice of location, his agenda, his terms. I'd like the opportunity to make a better impression." Gerald was quiet for a moment. "I'll pass that along," he said. "I'm not promising anything, I know, Daphne." He paused. "He's not unreasonable, but he doesn't forgive quickly, and he has options." "I know," she said again. He called her back 4 days later. Callum Reid would meet her for coffee. Tuesday morning. A diner in Bridgeport called Tully's near the Dan Ryan, 7:30. No boardroom, no view of the lake, no white glove staff. She said yes before Gerald finished the sentence. Tully's diner was exactly the kind of place that had no interest in impressing anyone. Vinyl booths the color of dried mustard, laminated menus with photographs, a pie case near the register displaying 4 options, one of which appeared to be coconut cream and was clearly the favorite. The coffee came in thick ceramic mugs and arrived before she had a chance to ask for it. Callum was already there when she walked in at 7:22. He was in a corner booth wearing a gray Henley and a canvas work jacket, reading a newspaper, an actual physical newspaper, folded in thirds. He had a plate of eggs and toast in front of him, mostly finished. He looked up when she walked in, measured her for a moment, then gestured at the bench across from him. She slid in. A server materialized with coffee. Daphne wrapped her hands around the mug and tried to decide how to begin. He beat her to it. "You built Holloway back up from about 11 million in AUM, he said. Not a question. Your father had taken it to near zero. You did it without outside capital, without a capital raise, living off management fees, and co-invest returns for the first 2 years. Most people don't know that detail because you've never talked about it publicly." She blinked. "You looked into me. You looked at me and assumed I was the help," he said. Not unkindly, just directly. "I figured I'd do it properly." There was a beat of something that was almost humor between them, though neither of them smiled. "That's accurate," she said. "About rebuilding the firm. Why?" he said. "Why what? Why didn't you raise outside capital? You could have. You had relationships. It would have been faster." She thought about the answer she usually gave to this question, which was about control and alignment of incentives and long-term fund structure. Then she thought about whether that was actually the true answer. "Because I didn't want anyone to see how bad it was," she said. "I was embarrassed, and I didn't trust anyone not to use it against me." He nodded. He drank his coffee. "My first deal almost killed the company," he said. "The Galesburg corridor. I had one investor, my college roommate's father, a retired dentist from Peoria. He'd put in $400,000. Everything he had saved. There were 8 months where I genuinely did not know if I was going to be able to repay him." He turned the coffee mug in his hands. "I slept on a cot in the site trailer for most of that period. I didn't go home to Rockford for Christmas that year because I couldn't afford the gas." She looked at him. "What happened?" "A freight contract came through in February. Small regional carrier. It wasn't enough to make us profitable, but it was enough to service the debt, and it bought us 4 more months." He paused. "The dentist got his money back, with interest. He still sends me a card at Christmas." There was a specific weight to a story like that, the kind of weight that belonged to a person who had actually lived it. Daphne recognized it because she had her own version of it. That particular flavor of fear that is not dramatic but is constant, the kind that lives in your chest for months at a time and makes everything taste slightly of metal. "I didn't know that story," she said. "No one does," he said. "I don't tell it usually." She asked him why he was telling it now. He looked at her steadily. "Because I think you understand what it costs to not tell it," he said. "And because I think that matters." They talked for 2 hours and 12 minutes, not about the fund, not about deal structures or management fees or preferred returns. They talked about the infrastructure of the middle of the country, the bridges that hadn't been updated since the Eisenhower administration, the rail lines that were functionally invisible to the coasts, the communities that had been told for 40 years that they were too expensive to save. Callum talked about those things the way other people talked about their families, with knowledge that was personal, with stakes that were real. Daphne found herself talking about her father, not the version of the story she told at conferences, which was clean and instructional, but the actual version. Coming into the office at 29 and realizing that the fund's books didn't match anything she'd been told. Confronting him. The silence afterward. The year they didn't speak while she quietly rebuilt what he'd left her. Callum listened. He didn't offer perspective she hadn't asked for. He didn't fill silences before they were ready to be filled. At 9:34, she looked at her watch and realized she had a call at 10 that she had completely failed to think about for the last 90 minutes. "I need to go," she said. She reached for her wallet. "It's covered," he said. "Callum, the eggs were $4, he said. "Don't make it a thing." She put her wallet away. At the door, with February wind coming off the Dan Ryan and the morning commute grinding past in both directions, she turned to him. "I want to be honest with you," she said. "I came here hoping to change your mind about the mandate, but I think I needed this conversation more than I needed the deal." He looked at her for a long moment. "Those two things aren't necessarily separate," he said. She wasn't sure what that meant. She thought about it on the cab ride back to the office. 3 weeks passed. She didn't reach out. She had told herself she wouldn't, and she held to that, which was harder than she expected. In the meantime, she found herself doing something she hadn't done in years, paying closer attention to the reflexes she'd stopped questioning, the way she scanned a room, the shorthand she used to sort people before they'd had a chance to speak, the way she moved through certain situations with an efficiency that looked like professionalism, but sometimes was just a failure to slow down. She started, quietly, making changes. Nothing dramatic, no announcement. She restructured how her firm's investor communications worked so that information about a meeting came before any visual encounter. She revamped her intake process for new relationships, longer first calls, fewer assumptions carried into rooms. She had a conversation with her head of investor relations, a sharp 29-year-old named Brianna, who had been trying to have that particular conversation with her for about 2 years and was visibly relieved that Daphne had arrived at it herself. "I should have listened to you earlier," Daphne told her. "Yes," Brianna said, without making it a bigger deal than it was. That was one of the things Daphne valued about her. On a Thursday afternoon in late April, her assistant forwarded an email from an address she didn't recognize. The subject line was, "Fund Structure, Introductory Deck Attached." The sender was Callum Reid. The deck was 41 slides. It outlined Meridian Structural's proposed fund structure, a 10-year closed-end vehicle targeting $1.2 billion in commitments, focused on infrastructure assets in the central United States, with a preference for operating assets rather than development stage projects. The returns profile was conservative by private equity standards, net IRR targets in the mid-teens rather than the aggressive upper 20s that most funds chased. The logic was sound: boring assets with long contracted cash flows, patient capital, minimal correlation to public markets. At the bottom of page 41, in the section labeled Manager Selection Criteria, there was a single paragraph that had been highlighted in yellow. "We are seeking a general partner who understands that the assets in this portfolio represent communities, not just balance sheets. The right manager will have demonstrated not only investment discipline, but the kind of judgment that holds up when no one is watching. This is not a quality that shows up in a track record. It has to be earned in the room." She read that paragraph 3 times. Then she called Gerald. "Did you know he was going to send this?" she said. "He told me he was considering it," Gerald said. "I didn't know when. What changed?" Gerald was quiet for a moment. "You didn't call him," he said. "You met him in a diner in Bridgeport, and you didn't follow up for 3 weeks. You didn't push." That mattered to him. Daphne looked out her window at the lake. It was the kind of clear April afternoon that made Chicago look like the city it was trying to be. "Tell me how to respond," she said. "Honestly," Gerald said. "That's all, just honestly." She wrote the response herself. No comms team, no consultant. She sat at her kitchen table on a Friday night with a glass of water and a legal pad, and wrote a draft by hand first, which was something she hadn't done since business school. She wanted to feel the weight of what she was saying before she committed it to a screen. She wrote that she had been moved by the structure of what he was proposing, and that she believed Holloway Capital could be the right manager, not because of their returns, though she was proud of those, but because they had spent the last 6 years learning to be patient with assets that required patience. She wrote that she had spent the past several weeks examining her own assumptions about how she operated and had found things she hadn't expected to find. She didn't frame that as a pitch. She framed it as a fact. She wrote, "I don't know if you've already found your manager, but if the question is still open, I would like the opportunity to earn it. Not in a boardroom. I'll come to where you are." She sent it on a Monday morning. His reply came Tuesday afternoon, 14 words. "Come to Rockford on Thursday. I'll send you the address. Bring your questions." The address turned out to be a freight rail yard on the south side of Rockford, alongside a stretch of track that Callum's company had been in the process of modernizing for the past 2 years. There was a converted site office at the edge of the yard, insulated shipping containers welded together and fitted with windows, a space heater, a coffee maker, and a wall of maps and engineering schematics that covered almost every surface. Callum met her in the yard wearing a hard hat and a safety vest over his canvas jacket. He handed her a hard hat without comment and walked her out along the length of the track, explaining what had been done and what remained to be done with the matter-of-fact precision of someone who had memorized every specification, but was also not above pointing out a particular weld he was proud of. There were workers moving along the track at various points. Callum greeted most of them by name. He remembered details, asked one man how his daughter's soccer tournament had gone, asked another whether the issue with the South Junction coupling had been resolved. The conversations were brief but complete. The men answered him in the way people answered someone they trusted, not someone they were managing around. Daphne watched this. She watched the way he moved through the yard and the way the yard moved around him, and she understood something she hadn't been able to fully articulate since the diner. That the source of his judgment about people was not abstract. It came from years of operating in places where the quality of your character was visible every day, where you couldn't hide behind a title or an office or a wardrobe, where the people you worked with knew very quickly whether you were real. She had spent 11 years in rooms that rewarded a certain kind of performance. She had gotten very good at the performance. What she had not always been good at was the thing underneath it. They talked for 4 hours in the site office. This time they talked about the fund. She asked every hard question she could think of. He answered directly, pushed back twice, acknowledged uncertainty in 3 places without apparent discomfort. She laid out her concerns about the return profile and the LP appetite for mid-teen net IRRs in the current environment. He had already modeled it. He walked her through the assumptions. At the end of it, she said, "I know," he said. "Is that a yes?" He looked at her for a moment. "It's a yes if you can tell me one thing." She waited. "The man you sent out of the room at the Cavendish," he said. "Not me, you didn't know who I was. If you'd known, would you have done it differently?" It was, she understood the actual question. Not "are you sorry?" and not "will you treat me well now that you know what I'm worth?" The question was whether the problem was about him specifically or about something larger. She thought about it honestly. "I'd like to say yes," she said, "but I think the more truthful answer is that I don't know, and that's the thing that bothers me. I know what I've changed in the past month. I don't know what I haven't found yet." He nodded. Slowly, the way he did when something mattered. "That's the right answer," he said. The formal agreement was signed 6 weeks later. Holloway Capital was named general partner of the Meridian Infrastructure Partners Fund I, with a target raise of $1.2 billion and a first close projected for the following spring. The announcement ran in 3 trade publications and 1 general business daily. The coverage focused on the size of the vehicle and the asset base. None of the coverage mentioned a hotel ballroom in downtown Chicago or a lobby or a diner in Bridgeport. None of it mentioned a man standing at a window holding a glass of sparkling water, being told politely to go wait somewhere else. Daphne read the coverage on a Thursday morning and thought about what was missing from it. Then she called Brianna into her office and told her she wanted to restructure the firm's mentorship program to include junior professionals from non-traditional finance backgrounds. People who had come up through construction, logistics, public works, the kind of knowledge base that her industry had a habit of filtering out in the first round of interviews. Brianna had a proposal ready. She had been holding it for 14 months. "You should have pushed harder on this," Daphne told her. "I did push," Brianna said pleasantly. "You just weren't ready to hear it." There's a thing that happens, sometimes, when you get something wrong in a way that's large enough and clear enough that you can't argue yourself out of it. The options are to reduce it, to contain it to a single incident and resolve it cleanly and move on, or to let it open something, to follow it down to wherever it leads. The first option is faster. The second is the one that changes you. Daphne had spent most of her career taking the first option. She was good at it. She was efficient and clear-eyed, and she did not waste time on feelings that didn't produce results. What she had not understood, until a man in a flannel shirt stood at a window above Lake Michigan and looked at her with an expression she couldn't read, was that there is a cost to that efficiency. Not always one you can see on the books, but a cost. She thought about that sometimes now, early mornings usually, before the day got going and the calendar filled, and the performance of running a firm reasserted itself. She thought about the dentist from Peoria who'd trusted a young man with his savings and gotten a Christmas card in return. She thought about a freight yard in Rockford and the way a crew of workers answered their boss's questions without guarding themselves first. She thought about what it meant to earn a room rather than simply controlling it. She was still learning the difference. She expected she would be for a long time. That, she had come to understand, was the point.